Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to make a start now, so I hope you're sitting comfortably. So a warm welcome to you all then, and thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to start by just introducing ourselves, if we may, as we always do, just for those who haven't joined us before, and so they can know who they are listening to. So my name is Karen. I'm the HR Knowledge Manager for HR Solutions, and I am leading the webinar today. And I'm joined by my colleague, Optin. She's our digital marketing executive. She's here sort of in the background, if you will. If you were to use your control panel to perhaps send any questions that you might have for us over, she will be collating those, and I will look to get back to you shortly after the webinar. So please do send any over that you might have. Also, as well, you can use that same part on the control panel, just where it says questions, to send her a message if you should have any technical problems. Of course, hopefully there won't be any at all, and it will all go smoothly. But if you do, just drop her a message in case it's something that's affecting, our end, and we can look to try and resolve it, especially if it's affecting everybody, and we'll do what we can. So we are going to be recording this session today, so it will be available on our website for you to watch again if you should like, or equally if you would like to share it, with your colleagues, then do feel free to do so. And if you'd like a copy of the slides, please feel free to get in touch and ask for a copy. We make those available on request as well. Okay, so hopefully you are aware that we've joined us today for a session on 5 ways in which managers can support mental health at work. So this is what we're going to be covering today. I'm breaking the webinar up into the following sections. Okay. So we do have some aims that we're going to try and achieve for you today. So firstly, to consider what an employee's duties are in respect of mental health. Also, just to try and understand some of the signs that someone might be struggling. And to improve awareness of how employers can support their employees and promote mental well-being. Okay, so those are the aims of the webinar session today. I expect it's going to take us about 45 minutes or so. All right, so let's start by having a little look at the scope of this topic. Okay, so 1 in 4 is the figure which is believed to be the number of people who will experience mental ill health at some point in their lives, okay? And that's according to the government's Department of Health. So it's a really high figure. And 300 million, so 300 million people worldwide are known to have suffered with depression. Okay, so depression is quite possibly the most common mental illness worldwide that we know of at the moment, with that huge figure, that huge number of people reported to have been affected. Now, according to ACAS, okay, ACAS say that the most common forms of mental ill health are anxiety, depression, phobic disorders, and obsessive compulsive disorders. Okay, so those are the most common ones according to ACAS. But there are currently over 200 mental health disorders recognized worldwide. Okay, 200 different ones. Now, you may well be able to think of some that perhaps don't, but typically they will fall into the following groups. Okay, so either a mood disorder, an anxiety type, a personality disorder, a psychotic disorder, okay, such as schizophrenia or psychosis, eating disorders, trauma-related disorders such as post-traumatic stress, substance abuse disorders as well. Okay, so typically a mental health disorder will fall into one of these categories. Now, with regards to the impacts on the employment market, it's estimated that in the UK, mental health problems cost employers £30 billion per year. Okay, so £30 billion a year is the estimated cost to UK employers, and those costs come from productivity, absence, and also recruitment costs as well. Okay, so it really is a substantial impact that mental health has on the employment market, just financially. So let's consider what, if any, legal duties an employer has towards mental health. Okay, well, as awareness of the scale of mental health issues is growing rapidly, you know, with that, we also, of course, have to consider our understanding of how people experiencing mental ill health can be supported in the workplace. So employers do have some specific legal duties, okay? They have a duty of care toward their employees. Now, this is a duty that we talk about a bit more commonly, it's a bit more readily used in general conversations, and it is a specific legal duty that comes out of contract law, okay, an employment contract. There is an implied duty of care that is ingrained within an employment contract, okay? So duty of care, firstly. Then we've also got a duty to provide a safe working environment, okay, and also a duty to prevent foreseeable injury, okay. So these two are perhaps discussed a little less often, unless you're particularly savvy with health and safety obligations, okay, which is where these two duties are derived from. So employers have to provide a safe working environment for a person, and they also have to prevent foreseeable injury. Okay, so injury potentially from mental health issues is not exempt from that. And then employers also have a duty to make reasonable adjustments. So again, this one is more commonly discussed in employment circles and in HR, and this is one which is derived from the Equality Act 2010 in respect of people who have a disability. So at the point at which a disability, a mental health issue might become a disability, there is a legal duty on employers to make what's called reasonable adjustments. Now, it might be fair to say that where managers are perhaps a bit more comfortable and it's a bit more common to deal with individuals who have physical ill health issues, they may not feel quite as confident with how to approach somebody suffering with mental ill health. You know, questions like, is it okay to ask what's going on? To what extent can I discuss it with them, or is it entirely private and personal and, you know, not for me to explore with a person? So there is perhaps still a gap between how comfortable managers feel about addressing an issue and their duty to support staff. So for that reason, it is wise to spend time thinking about, you know, what we can do, and you are making steps towards that just by attending this webinar today, you know, so I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted with regards to that. But we do need to spend time, you know, thinking about how, firstly, the mental well-being of employees may be supported, okay? And with that also comes the need to consider how we can help our managers to be better equipped to support them. So there is really a two-pronged approach we should take, you know, not just putting in place support for employees, but also how are those who we want to support our employees being supported themselves in order to do it. So, not only are we starting to think about how we can react, to those who are perhaps suffering with mental ill health, many employers are also now beginning to consider how they can be proactive, okay, and how they can actually promote positive mental health and well-being at work in the first place, in order to try and mitigate and reduce any issues or problems that people might experience. So, by providing support with mental well-being at work, it really can lead to a happier and more dedicated team of staff, and it can help to reduce the severity, duration, and quantity of mental ill health issues that might arise in the workplace as well. So, let's have a think now about how we can spot the signs of somebody who might need our support in the workplace. It's important to be able to try and spot the signs or have some awareness, because after all, the earlier that we are able to do that and to identify a person, the sooner that they may be able to get support, okay, and the sooner we can step in and try and provide that for them, okay, which may well prevent it from becoming more serious, so that's a really important thing that we can try and do for a person. Now, I think it's important to start out really by saying that there may well not always be obvious signs that someone is struggling. It's very much the case that people still find it difficult to talk about their personal mental health issues. We can advocate talking and opening up, but it is often when someone is struggling that they find it the most difficult to talk and to open up, okay? So actually, there is general advice just to have regular one-to-ones with employees in an environment which feels private and safe to speak in, okay? So it may be something you do with appraisals, but they're generally all focused on performance and whether you're meeting your targets and so on and so forth. So this might want to be something separate to that and is just a relaxed one-to-one catch-up. How's things going at work? How's things going in your job? How are you? Type of conversation where it's unlikely they're going to be overheard. You're not perhaps in those glass rooms that are becoming more and more popular in office environments. So this is a really strong piece of advice that's coming through with trying to identify somebody who might be struggling. But there are some common signs of mental ill health, and these also mirror what the signs are for somebody suffering from a disproportionate or unhealthy amount of stress as well, okay? So these are as follows. Any changes in behaviour, mood, and interactions with others, okay? And this works both ways, okay? So we'll perhaps more commonly think about a mental ill health issue causing somebody to become quite down, a bit more pessimistic, perhaps more tearful or quiet than normal, okay? And absolutely, that may well be a sign that somebody who's perhaps otherwise fairly outgoing or chatty is starting to struggle. But also, there are many introverted personalities and people who are a bit quieter and like to fly under the radar. And if they are suddenly becoming extremely extrovert and, almost giddy and excitable, that might actually be a sign that something's not right, okay, because this is not the norm for them. Something may be putting a strain on them that's causing them to behave in a way that is not right for that person. And so again, that may still well be a prompt to sit down with an individual and just say, how's things going? You know, is everything all right? Notice you're a bit different to your normal self, okay? So changes in moods and behaviour. We also then have changes in their performance and standard of work. And again, it works both ways, okay? So perhaps more typically, we might think about a deterioration, somebody not hitting deadlines, more mistakes in their work, and so on, as being an indicator that perhaps they are struggling to concentrate. You know, perhaps their time, attention and focus is being diverted to some issues going on. And the flip side also might well be that somebody who perhaps generally normally comes in and just does what they've got to do, you know, in a day, who's suddenly spending their evenings at work and their weekends at work and, you know, going way above and beyond and producing lots of extra stuff, you know, might be great, but might also indicate actually this person's perhaps not getting the rest that they should be getting, and, you know, what's going on with their work-life balance here? Why are they investing all their time into work? So again, that can work both ways. Another sign is somebody appearing to be more tired than normal, anxious, withdrawn, or got reduced interest in the things that they would normally otherwise be interested in, okay? Especially, I think this is the case if this is happening on a regular basis. You know, it may be that even if you just spot it once or twice, it's a sign that somebody's starting to struggle with their mental health, because they might otherwise be doing a good job of concealing it. But particularly if you're noticing that these things are much more frequent in a person, you know, it's much more likely to be a sure sign that there is something going on that they are perhaps struggling with. We also have changes in habits such as appetites, okay? If they're a smoker or drink, you know, any increased smoking or drinking, again, could be an indicator that they're starting to struggle with their mental health, as they're starting to use these things perhaps as a bit of a crutch. And then lastly, we have higher than normal absences or lateness, okay? So if you've perhaps got somebody who is just really struggling to get out of bed in the morning, not able to meet their commitments in that way, perhaps telephoning in to say that they're not very well. And I think, unfortunately, it does still seem to be the case that a lot of employees won't telephone, you know, their absence and report that they're struggling with mental health. They still do tend to say that they've perhaps got a cold or, you know, food poisoning or something like that, not out of a want to be deliberately deceptive to their employer, but just out of a want to not share the fact that they're struggling with their mental health. So we perhaps need to just spot any signs of increased levels of absence and consider whether there could be something else going on there that we might need to support them with. Okay, so let's have a bit of a think now then about providing support at work before we move on to our 5 key ways of doing so. So we do need to be supportive of our employees, okay, but the advice is very clear. Employers and managers are not expected to be experts in mental health, okay, in any way. Just as you are not expected to be an expert in any physical type of illness or learning disability. ACAS advise that employers should, however, at least know where they and their team can go for further support, okay, both internally and externally. So if you're actually starting to think about maybe putting together some sort of well-being strategy, okay, then you'd be well advised to consider how you can support well-being and mental health in two ways, so under these two umbrellas: internal sources of support at work and external sources that we can direct somebody to. And if you do that, then you will be putting that strategy together in line with ACAS's advice, which is always a good thing. So we're going to look now then at just 5 ways, okay, in which employers and managers can use HR to begin to form that wellbeing strategy. You know, and I'm using that phrase wellbeing strategy, but if you're just looking at general ways to try and support staff, you know, then that's great and equally as valuable to staff, I'm sure. So these are ways that you can do that as well. All right, so here we are. The first of the 5 ways is thinking about your organisation's culture. Okay, so I think it's interesting to consider that actually it's believed less than half of employees will tell their manager about a mental health problem. Less than half. So if we've got 1 in 4 people, you know, that we work with have or are going to suffer with a mental health problem, and less than half of those will tell their manager, then that's really, you know, quite a big number of people who are hiding it or not volunteering that information themselves. Okay, but nonetheless, we must still be trying to do things to care for them and provide support. Now, Mind, so the mental health charity Mind, they have a number of tools and guidance documents on their website which are specifically designed to help employers to support individuals in the workplace. Okay, so there's a specific section for employers to go on and have a look at, and there's all kinds of things on there, so I would suggest having a look. And they typically start with creating an open culture about mental health and well-being. Now, they actually believe that organisations need to send a very clear signal to staff that their mental health matters. Okay, and that being open about it will lead to support and won't lead to discrimination. Okay, so being open is going to lead to support, and that's it. They explain, you know, that one simple way of doing this is actually to communicate that mental health will be treated in the same way as physical health. And I think you can't say fairer than that, really. Now, it's important to remember that, you know, it's all right me saying, you know, think about your culture and spend a few hours looking at ways you can adapt that. But of course, you know, culture is a very fickle, finely tuned thing, which is incredibly subjective, you know, and transient in nature. A culture change is not going to happen overnight. You can take some initial proactive steps, and we're actually going to look at a few ways that you could do that in a moment. And they are important, you know, there'll be important steps to take, but it's going to be maintaining this message, and then actually following through with what you're promising or putting in place when the time comes, which is going to be vitally important. And it's really here where relationships at work start to matter as well, particularly that between an employee and their line manager, who's typically someone's first port of call, you know, for support with work. So it doesn't happen overnight. It's got to be something that we look to maintain. But let's look at 3 suggestions of ways in which you could try and adapt your culture to being a bit more mental health friendly. Okay. So, regular catch-ups. This is something we've actually touched upon earlier, particularly in terms of seeking out those individuals who might be less forthcoming. I mean, typically, if you ask somebody how they are, they're going to say, "I'm fine, thanks." And how are you? You know, you're not going to, in most circumstances, you're not going to get an in-depth answer or find out if someone's struggling with mental health just by asking them once how they are. You know, if you have a regular catch-up, as we mentioned, in which you're creating an environment in which you can really just have a conversation, it enables you a little bit more naturally to ask a few times, you know, so how are you doing? How are you really? You know, is there anything going on that is difficult or you're struggling with? You know, and then perhaps even asking a third time. You know, it's a bit more of a natural way if you're in a private environment in which you can probe in a way that doesn't feel too invasive or inappropriate. And it might be, depending on how forthcoming they are, that they will discuss with you any sources of unhealthy levels of stress or anxiety that are manifesting, you know, both at work but also at home. You know, be up to them to volunteer that information. But, you know, I think most people generally accept that home life just does spill into work life sometimes. You know, we don't stop being ourselves when we get to work. So knowing about things going on for a person privately can sometimes help us to manage them effectively at work as well. I would say unhealthy levels of stress. Stress is, of course, a natural response, a natural physiological response, which is sometimes beneficial, but it's when it starts to become unhealthy, you know, that it can start to impact on someone's mental health. So we want to be keeping tabs on that. And after all, we do have a duty to manage stress from a health and safety aspect as well. So regular catch-ups then, so you know that could happen both in terms of a one-to-one with a person, but also we can regularly review mental health and well-being at regular group meetings. So if you perhaps have working parties, you know, that consider the operations of an organisation, it might be that you put mental health and well-being on that agenda. So it's routinely going to be discussed, and it's perhaps not going to be that you discuss the specifics of anyone's personal situations in that meeting, but you might just be considering it as a whole. You know, what is our culture like here? What else can we do to support people? What might be going on at the moment that is adding particular strains on individuals? Okay, so by doing that, it's going to really start to force people to have an open dialogue about mental health and to embed a positive attitude and behaviour about approaching mental health as a topic of discussion, to normalise it, and to help individuals think not only about their own but also their colleagues around them and their mental health and what factors can affect it. So it can really heighten awareness and open up dialogue about mental health. Okay. Now, managers can also help with the culture in their management style. I think sometimes line managers, especially historically, could take a very one-size-fits-all approach. You know, this is how I am and people have to take me as I am, and that's that. But I think we're very much moving towards times now where we expect managers to be a little bit more emotionally clever about how they approach individuals in order to get the most out of them. So encouraging and supporting a teamwork culture. You know, you're all working for one organisation that has shared goals. So let's work together, not against each other. You know, promoting positive behaviours to avoid conflict, you know, and unhealthy competition. And also just trying to encourage, you know, well-being factors like exercise and regular social activities as a hugely beneficial social element that comes to being at work, you know, that can mean it's actually better for people to be in work than perhaps off sick sometimes, you know, depending on their situation. So actually recognizing that as a value and a benefit of work is important, and thinking about how we can improve people's balance in life in those ways through work is highly beneficial and valuable too. Another way that you can start to boost a more open culture for discussing and thinking about mental health, and very inexpensive way as well, is actually in terms of your information sharing and collating sources of support. Okay, so we talked before about internal and external sources. You know, this could be a free internal source of support. So why not consider creating a permanent information board, or perhaps if you do have a company intranet site that your employees can all access, you know, for various bits of information about what's going on. You know, you could have a page which talks about the importance of mental well-being, okay, which also perhaps then directs employees to other internal sources of support that you might have in place, but also external sources as well. And just as a for instance, you know, I'm talking about the many different websites there are, and also free helpline numbers that are available, which offer support and guidance, you know, with very specific situations, you know, depression, suicide, bereavement, drug and alcohol abuse, body image, and so many more different things. And, you know, you may well never know if an employee uses this site, but, you know, hey, it's something totally free that you can do, which helps people by just collating all these different resources in one place, just to make it even easier for somebody who might be struggling to ask for help to find that help that they need, okay? And, you know, without them having to say, this is my problem specifically, if you've got a plethora of different problems and resources that they can go to for those, you know, they don't need to ask. So it just is removing barriers all the time to access help. If you did have a board like this as well, you know, just in itself, it's going to demonstrate very visibly to your staff that you actually advocate awareness of mental ill health and seeking help, you know, so it's a very healthy thing for you to do for that reason as well. And my last tip on culture specifically is something which I've gleaned following an article which I read from somebody who went through a very traumatic and painful experience, and what they have suggested might have helped somebody they knew. And you could call it what you like, but I'm terming it a welfare opt-in scheme, okay? So perhaps akin to an emergency contact, you might want to consider building into, say, your induction program, asking your new member of staff whether or not they would be happy for you to jot down the name and number of someone they trust who you could contact if you were to ever have concerns about that person's mental well-being. You know, just like you might do if somebody had an accident at work and had to go in an ambulance, you know, who could I call if I was a bit worried about you and your behavior at work and whether or not you're okay, you know. And even if it's not just because you think that there could be something wrong, because you might, you know, putting a bit of pressure on a, you know, a particular line manager to do that, and of course they don't have to identify someone who's struggling specifically, but even if there's something a little bit more obvious, like something which is particularly stressful which has happened at work, or potentially triggering, okay? And by triggering, I mean something that is likely to, especially with people who have suffered with a mental health issue before, something that's likely to bring it on again or bring symptoms of it on or worsen it, okay? So if something potentially stressful or triggering happens at work, like a suspension, okay? I mean, with suspension, we often try and say, look, this is not an assumption of guilt at this point. It's a preventative measure that we have to take whilst we're looking into something. But we all know that suspension is very traumatic for most people, an incredibly upsetting experience, you know, as can be a redundancy announcement for people. These can all be potentially triggering things that happen at work. And so perhaps it might be that you say, look, if something like this happens at work, we would like to get in touch with a person who you trust to let them know this has happened. Okay, because what you're doing then is really improving and strengthening that employee's support network. Okay, they might not necessarily ring home and say, look, I've just been suspended, I'm feeling horrendous, you know, we've just had a redundancy announced, I don't know how I'm going to support my family anymore, you know, who are just feeling totally overwhelmed. But if we contact somebody, you know, we're building that support network. So we are, you know, as an employer, and also that person at home, that family member or friend, you know, is there to keep an eye on that person and check that things are okay. You know, and in the most extreme situations, actually helps to improve their own safety as well, okay, when they could be struggling to look after themselves. So this is something you may want to consider. All right, so that was culture. Next, a second way in which managers can look to support mental health at work, okay, is through something called mental health first aiders. So I've spoken to a number of employers who have actually been on the course and implemented these already, but it's still a relatively new concept. So for those of you who haven't heard of it, mental health champions or mental health first aiders, okay, essentially are people, so it could be employees who are willing and interested in becoming a champion or first aider, or managers can undertake a training course, okay, and on this course they're taught to spot the signs of someone who might be struggling with mental health, okay, and to then offer initial help to their colleagues, okay, and to guide them towards further appropriate support. So they aren't going to undertake this course and become therapists, and they're not going to be expected to be therapists, okay, but they are going to become people who really understand how to listen, really listen to a person, how to give reassurance that's valuable, and to respond to comments or areas of concern that might be raised, okay, even in a crisis, and they might even be able to go a step further and reach out to somebody before a crisis situation happens, okay. So getting mental health first aiders is really being highly advocated. You know, it's considered that it would build employees' confidence in general. So everybody in the organisation, by knowing that we have mental health champions or first aiders, it can improve everyone's confidence about having a more open conversation about mental health at work and just break down the stigma that there still is, particularly about talking about somebody's own personal situation. It can help to encourage someone to access support earlier, you know, because hopefully they've got a person or a few people who they can go to, who they might, you know, they might feel more able to open up to one person than another. So it's worth having at least two if you're going to go for it, and may be able to get a faster recovery, okay, by having that source of support. It can help to minimise preventable issues and, again, embed a positive culture that we were talking about before across the organisation. So this would be an internal source of support if you looked to send people on mental health first aid courses. third way is to consider something called wellness action plans. So again, this is a relatively new concept, okay? So a wellness action plan is probably more geared towards people who have experienced mental ill health before, okay, and so understand their condition and how it affects them to a degree. But it may even prompt them to think about that in a little bit more detail. But it encourages them to constructively sit down and set out what their triggers might be, okay? So what potentially is going to worsen my condition or bring it on? What are my symptoms and what early warning signs are there for me that this might be flaring up again or becoming more difficult to manage? It helps them to consider how their mental ill health might impact on their performance at work, okay, which in turn might help you or their line manager to understand what to expect if their mental health should deteriorate, and equally then what you can do to try and mitigate that or support them with it. Okay, so this could be a private document that they just do for themselves, you know, and keep to themselves, but perhaps use it as a reference point to think, right, maybe I need to do X, Y, and Z because I can see that I'm starting to trigger and react. Or it might be something that they share with a line manager so that you've both got copies. And again, it can just be a prompt for a line manager as well to think, I wonder if this person is displaying these symptoms, I'm going to have a chat and we can think about this wellness action plan and putting it into place so we get the support there for them. Now, the charity Minds, so again, the mental health charity, has got a practical guide on creating wellness action plans available on their website, totally free for employers to download. Okay, so this is a free resource of something free that you can put in place to support people with mental health. Now, it might be that it's something you discuss with an individual in a one-to-one, you know, rather than, you know, marching up to somebody who you know is suffering with depression, for example, and saying, here, do a wellness action plan, because it's probably not going to be very appropriate. So it's going to be something that you perhaps suggest in a private one-to-one. But equally, if you do have an intranet site or an information board about promoting positive mental health and well-being, why not put the concept on there as well, you know, for everybody to be aware of. I think for me, these just really are going to be a good way of enabling people who do, again, as I say, more likely have a long-term condition to just improve their own understanding of their condition, but also from an occupational perspective, helps them to think about how it impacts on their working lives, and then just to self-manage both their environment and symptoms, but also, you know, just to know when to ask for help before things get too difficult. So I'm quite a big supporter of wellness action plans. Okay, next up then, so fourth way that we can support staff is by having an employee assistance program. So these have been around much longer than the other two concepts we've been discussing, but still unknown to many employers, to be fair. So if you've not heard of them before, sometimes they're referred to as EAPs, and they are basically first and foremost a helpline, okay, manned by trained counsellors who are there usually 24/7, okay, to assist somebody, to assist an employee who might be struggling with something. And the idea is, you know, that things both at work and at home impact us and could therefore impact performance at work. And so any issues that somebody is struggling with, they can call this line and talk to somebody confidentially and for free. Okay, so they might be able to talk about personal matters such as health, anxiety and depression, bereavement, but also things like financial problems, mortgage advice, any gambling problems that they might have, and more. And also work matters, so any difficult relationships at work, again, perhaps a redundancy that's been announced, they can talk about that as well. And then what can happen as part of the programme, the counsellors can refer employees onto more specific course of support, such as an ongoing course of face-to-face counselling, for example. So they can be really, really great and add an awful lot of value to an employee's life, to be perfectly honest. Now, these schemes are entirely confidential, okay? So again, it's unlikely employers will ever know if somebody has contacted the EAP, but they are an excellent benefit, so an excellent thing to consider as part of your benefits package, and really excellent EAP schemes can be found at a fairly nominal rate. I'm talking pounds per employee per year to an employer. Okay, and if I haven't sold it to you enough, I like to tell people about a Court of Appeal ruling, so not a sort of bog standard employment tribunal, but a Court of Appeal, so quite high up ruling, recently stated that any employer offering a confidential counselling service with access to treatment is unlikely to be found in breach of the duty of care. Okay, so tribunals love them as well. Now, these schemes are often connected to occupational health services, so if there was to be any recommendations from an occupational health therapist, then of course suggestions such as that will need to be acted on where reasonably appropriate, and we've still got to provide a safe working environment and so on, but this is clearly a very valuable benefit that employers can offer for a huge number of reasons. And lastly then, I just want to talk about adjustments. Okay, so probably something we're a bit more familiar with, a lot more common for us to discuss in HR and employment worlds. But, I've just put it as adjustments because adjustments full stop, to support people with mental ill health is always advisable. Okay. And I mentioned right at the start when we were talking about employers' duties, when mental ill health amounts to a disability, there then becomes a specific legal duty on employers to consider what we call reasonable adjustments, okay, and to implement them where appropriate, okay. And the aim is to try and ensure that the person is not at a disadvantage as much as possible because of that disability. Okay. So reasonable adjustments. And I think it's worth just noting here for a moment that actually an employee does not necessarily have to have a formal diagnosis to be protected against disability discrimination, okay, or therefore to be entitled to reasonable adjustments. All right, they do not necessarily have to have a formal diagnosis to be entitled to reasonable adjustments. So employers really do need to be savvy about what can amount to a disability, okay, and then to consider the person in front of them and their circumstances and whether or not, regardless of the fact they may not have been formally diagnosed, yet, because hopefully they will get medical support, but whether or not they are likely to be described in a way that's akin to a description of a disability in the Equality Act. And if you think that they are, then we should be doing what we can to support them and have a legal duty to do so. Okay, so let's just have a quick think about adjustments a little bit more. So adjustments are anything that can be reasonably provided, removed or adapted to help improve performance and attendance. Okay, and this can be beneficial both for somebody's self-esteem, you know, if they're actually in work and don't feel like they're letting, you know, the side down, but also improves their morale and commitment, and equally that of their colleagues who they work with, you know, because absence can have a big psychological impact on those who are still at work, actually, you know, who are perhaps picking up the slack and so on. And also, of course, just the overall performance of a business. You know, businesses perform better the more fully staffed they are. So adjustments are great at improving performance and attendance. And some examples of reasonable adjustments for mental ill health can include the following. So temporary or flexible working patterns, slightly lighter duties, perhaps for a period, maybe working from home for a few days here and there, moving them away from noisy areas. So of course, if it's appropriate for that person and they think it's a good idea, if they've got an awful lot going on in their mind, then actually being in a quieter area can be hugely helpful for them, you know, thinking clearly. Maybe, if appropriate, in the individual circumstances, amending absence reporting procedures. You know, sometimes perhaps people with selective mutism, for example, or people who feel less able to say, it is my depression that is flaring up again. I think I'm experiencing psychosis again, you know, don't want to call up and say that out loud, you know. So allowing text or emails, for example, can be an adjustment. Also considering, and it links to temporary and flexible working patterns, but hours. If you've got somebody doing antisocial hours and actually moving their times of work to be around people a bit more, you know, or if you're worried about somebody's levels of concentration, making it so that they can avoid heavy traffic times, you know, might be a reasonable adjustment as well, which is appropriate and can really help someone to feel supported and reduce the stress and strain that they might be experiencing. Okay, so those are just 5 ways that you can look to support mental health and well-being at work. There are so many resources online though available, and many specific to employers too. Okay, so do get online and have a look if you'd like to continue to do so after this webinar. I've talked about the mental health charity Mind a few times, and if you actually go to your control panel and have a look at the handouts section, I have put 2 documents there which I think are probably going to be the most handy starting points for the majority of you anyway, if you'd like to download those and have a read after this session. So have a look at those, but also go to the ACAST website too, okay, because of course that is very much employer focused, and there are lots of pages on there now, not only for supporting somebody with mental ill health, but also about how to promote a positive mental well-being and a positive environment in the first place. So have a look at that. It makes for a good, informative read. So we've come to the end of our session then today. If you haven't been able to get your question over and you would like to, then you can still contact us and do that using the following details. You'll probably get a follow-up email after this as well with my email on, so feel free to drop me a question over if there's anything you'd like to clarify or would just like to ask me. I do like getting them. Just to let you know, we have what's called a knowledge base, and you, even if you don't have full access, you can get a feel for what sort of things on there if you go to this website. We have, for example, further pages about managing depression and stress at work, and so on. So there's all kinds of useful bits of information and guidance for employers on there. And if you're interested, we can get you signed up. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending. I really do hope you've managed to get something valuable out of it that's either been a point of interest or as a takeaway that you might implement. And good luck and take care. Hope you join us for another webinar sometime soon. All the best. Bye-bye.